So in learning outcomes, we are looking at understanding what kind of risks the business can face and how, and let's put it this way, how they will manage those risks. So after understanding a bit of risk analysis and assessment, we want to now look at practically looking at what kind of risks does the business face. So if I look at very briefly and maybe ask you a quick question in terms of why do you think businesses need to look at assessing risk?
To make sure they keep on top of everything they've got to keep on top of. If you don't manage your risk, your whole company's at stake. You've got to know whereabouts you are and what sort of risk you're willing to take to keep afloat.
That's correct, yes. But if I just step back and if I say, in some cases, if everything is to happen in an ideological way and you go by the books, which does not, practically happen in daily life, what most organizations need to look at is the process of understanding that if things do not happen the way they have planned, they need to look at some sort of contingencies. And when we look at contingencies, that is where the aspect to a certain extent of what is called risk analysis or, things which could adversely affect the business operations or workings of the organization could, actually come in. And that would be the reason why businesses look at doing risk analysis. So what you've said is correct. But if I look at it, the person working in finance or the person who's responsible for finances of the organization, the first thing or he or she does is when she or he comes into the morning would be to look at a bank statement, look at pending invoices, receivables, because his or her role is primarily to look at and ensure that there is enough working capital available within the organization, debt is minimized, and the credit that they have given out in the market is recoverable, because that is related to the job description. So if you look at a sales or a marketing guy, you look at somebody in business development, you look at somebody in healthcare, in particular, when you come into your daily job and you're coming in for work, you know what you're expected to do. And what you tend to do is you look at ins and out of what you're expected to do, and you see if that is going as per plan or not. If that is not happening, then obviously at some stage they are looking at analyzing, or you are looking at personally introspecting into what has gone wrong or what could potentially go wrong. And that is where you are essentially looking at studying just the various dimensions of risk in a way to understand what could go wrong, and if this is to go wrong, I will get pulled by my boss, or I will lose my job, or I'll have different consequences. Now, in order to understand what are the various drivers of risk, what we need to look at is a framework here again, which basically demarcates that into two different types. One is internal risks, the other is external risks. So they are driven by factors or things which are happening either internal to the organization or either external to the organization. So when we look at risks which are internal, things like bad management of cash flows, workflows, budgeting, things like management of research, if an organization, if you look at the pharma companies which spend a lot of money on research and development to develop a drug, if a lot of money is being overspent, it is something which is driven internally by the management or the board, and that tends to be an internal risk. You can also look at internal risks, things like which would be in staff, it could be in investment that the company or the business is doing. And when you look at some of the external risks, it could be things like Brexit, for example, is an external risk to a lot of organizations today, even if you're directly or indirectly not affected, but it is posing an external risk because this is beyond your control. So we go back to the terms like micro and macro. Micro means internally, macro means externally. So we're looking at financial risks which could happen because of Brexit. If the economy is to go into recession, if the inflation is to rise, the exchange rate between dollar to a pound, if this is to change, if the pound falls further, import-export, businesses which are involved in export-import could get affected. So those are risks which tend to be external. So external risks tend to be financial. They could be operational to a certain extent because bad weather, for example, could cause an operational risk, and those tend to be external. Internal tend to be within the control of the organization. And if we have to look at an example here, in terms of classifying them into different types of risks, there are 4 types. So we look at this particular figure and then we talk about, financial risk, strategic risk, operational, and risks which are related to hazards. So in this case, we classify them as environmental risks in particular, or risks which are when you subcontract or when you depend on ancillary suppliers or partners to be able to deliver those services, we will call them as risks which are classified as hazard risks. And those are the 4 types that we need to look at in this particular learning outcome, so that if a business is to identify the prime types of risk it can face in running its operations or selling or providing its products and services, they tend to be these 4 types: strategic, financial, operational, and hazardous risk. Now, what I've done is I've looked at defining them by choosing some real life examples. So when we look at sources of risks from a business point of view, there could be risks which are related to capital. It could be, if I look at a company now, an organization, if we take, say, for example, the NHS or any organization, for that, say, Tesco, for example, what kind of risks it could have? It could have risks, from a point of view of IT. If the till system is to stop working, if their IT resources to stop working, that is a system or a technology risk. If it stops complying with legislation, for example, within the stores, or does not pay minimum wage pay to its workers, it is risking what is called the compliance risks, which are primarily related to regulation or the Minimum Wage Act, or in this case, legislation. Sometimes the business will also have risks, which is like over-reporting of profits, which Tesco has done in the past, and they were fined. So that could be risks which are primarily looking at in the short term over-reporting of the profits, and that could be financial risk. It could have risks which are business or environment-led. That would mean that Brexit could be posing an environmental risk to it from a certain aspect, because here the outcome of the Brexit, how it happens, it leads to a fall in the value of pound, or how it affects its operation overseas, could be an environmental risk. Sometimes when managers take risks, or when I say not risk, they take decisions to expand into a different geography or a country, to expand business operations, could be risks which are related to the long-term, say for example, long-term expansion of the business, and they tend to be what are called the strategic risks. Now, if I look at this from a point of view of elaborating into individual slides, so if I just look at one example of what are strategic risks, we would look at, in strategic risks, you could do a pestle analysis, which is one of the frameworks that we talk about in terms of if Tesco is to expand aggressively and they say, okay, we're going to open operation in 3, 4, 5 different countries, and that is a strategic move that they're looking at making, then in those cases, they will have to look at considering factors like political factors, factors which are related to, economic growth within a particular country. Because if they're deciding to expand into an emerging market and they say, okay, the business is going to be good, they must have done some background checks or, some referral to marketing pilots to see how's the economy going to grow over the number of years. Then we look at things which are related to socio-cultural risks. Some of the products and services that they introduce might not go well, so they have to study the local environment to be able to ensure that they are aware of the culture and the preferences of the people. They can look at technological risks. So those kind of things which typically tend to be related to say for example technology, could also be posing risks to the overall strategy of expanding into a country. And then similarly, we look at environmental risk and legal risk, because they have to follow local legislation and the required laws in that country to be able to start appointing or hiring people who would run these operations. So when we look at these kind of risks, they are all categorized under business strategy or strategic risks, and that is one such example of how a company would look at say for example reading, understanding, and identifying the risks which are related to, say, one such part which is strategic risks. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
In the second slide, I've given an example of financial risks. So taking the same example, but I've looked at talking about financial risks from a PLC UK PLC point of view, wherein the Bank of England, if you look at during the financial crisis, looked at quantitative easing. They did QE1, QE2, and then after QE2, they said, okay, enough is enough. The rates of interest are quite low. Money is available quite cheaply in the market in terms of lending happening from BOE, Bank of England, to the other banks, and that allowed the economy to go back into putting money into the pockets of the consumer, which meant liquidity and which meant that UK came out of recession. So when we look at financial risks, we look at risks which are related to managing of money, working capital, budgeting, all those kind of things are covered under, say, again, financial risks which an organization could look at, and that would mean different types. And sometimes companies look at or organizations look at planning, and that planning could be if the company is looking at raising long-term capital, they need capital and they need to look at long-term planning. You will see that the government also issues bonds. In the case of companies, they issue debentures or shares, and that is primarily looking at kind of generating or raising money from the market in order to fund some of the operations or strategic decisions which the company is looking at taking, which is expansion into, say, emerging markets or businesses which they take, in terms of looking at going into new markets for launching products. Now, in the second part, what we want to understand is when we have identified these different types of risks, how are these risks going to be managed? So here we are going to apply the risk management framework, and this risk management framework will look at those 4 options of either deflecting risk, mitigating risk, minimizing risk, or accepting risk. And here what you have to do is basically take up an example to explain how different types of risks would affect a business organization. So in your case, you could look at taking your own organization, Age UK, or maybe an organization in which you'll be able to explain the 4 types of risks and how the company would look at, or the organization would look at managing this risk by cross-referencing the risk matrix in terms of describing that with an example of an organization. The third part of it talks about taking one type of that risk out of the 4 that we've discussed, which could be for strategic, financial, hazardous risk, or related to the operational risk, and you have to assess that area within a particular business. So here, what we're going to be looking at is I've picked up an example of technological risks, and in that I've picked up cybersecurity, which today is a very high risk area for most organizations because of data which organizations hold. So when you look at the NHS in particular, you look at some of the public sector organizations which hold large amounts of data like banks and other bits. A lot of these organizations need to have an ICO certification, the Information Commissioner's Office certification, or an accreditation to say that they manage data, they store data, but then they have things in place which allow them to manage this data more effectively. So I've taken an example of systems and control risks, which are under the operational risk areas. What you have to look at is maybe pick up an organization and one particular area of risk, and that is what you need to elaborate here to say why this is high risk. Now, in an organization like ours, for example, give you an example. In our case, what we have, there are certain areas which are called as low risk areas, medium risk, and high risk areas. So here in this task, we're looking at high risk area. What are the high risk areas? We hold a lot of personal information of learners. Now, that personal information of learners should not fall into the wrong hands, because that poses high risk, because it could lead to an identity loss, theft, or it could also mean that the data of some of the personal data and profiles of some of the learners could be misused to look at fraud and other reasons, and that is a high risk area. So in our case, what we tend to do is most of the pre-assessment that is done with regards to the eligibility, the documentation like passport, driver's license, and the student file kind of thing is put under a lock and key, and only 1 or 2 people have access to that kind of information. And that tends to be the data, under the data protection law, we have somebody called DPO, Data Protection Officer, and that person is responsible for ensuring that this information does not fall into the wrong hands. If I look at a larger organization like a bank, in those cases when they have details of customer transaction, details of your account details, your card details, they need to ensure that this data does not fall into the wrong hands. And when they look at that, they employ a lot of different types of security measures to ensure that they make sure that this data is highly protected, and that is done through employing lots of systems in place, and those could then also be looked at being audited every month, every week, or even on a daily basis to ensure that there are no loopholes or areas wherein these systems or vulnerabilities could be exploited by, say, in this case, hackers, because online theft or fraud essentially is increasing, and I think it potentially costs £480 million every year to the banks in the UK alone because of wrong transactions or fraudulent transactions or identity being stolen, card details being stolen. So in the third assessment criteria here, what we are looking at is you have to identify some of the high risks in a particular business and talk about that high risk. Now, whether that is strategic, operational, financial, or a hazardous risk, you need to pick and choose just one type and explain it with the point of view of an organization. Now, what I have done is I have looked at defining this as reputational, something which could lead to a long-term loss of value for the organization in terms of market capitalization, things like brand value being eroded, and in some cases, it leading to conflicts or leading to high-risk conflicts, which would mean that sometimes you will see that these risks pose sanctions on companies or the trading policies of those companies because they have not been able to manage some of the information or some of the service level agreements, and that tends to impose restrictions on how they can conduct business. So these are different types of risks which tend to be high, classified as high in terms of their levels, because it could impede the company actually or the organization actually doing their operations on a usual basis or on a regular basis. Now, in the last part, what we are looking at is how do companies avoid these risks? So we need to talk about risk avoiding or management strategies in a bit more detail. And here, what I've done is I've put together a few slides wherein I put in a bit of a risk management framework, which talks about how the risk management can be done. And this is done using a risk management cycle or a framework. And this tends to involve, everybody and the entire process, which is in terms of what we saw in one of the slides, which is starting with analysis, looking at then, identification of those risks, and then minimizing of the risks within the organization, and then reviewing and regular monitoring, which ensures that these, problems or issues do not arise again and do not lead to, say, for example, either the company suffering a loss, financial loss, reputational loss, sanctions, which could be because of non-compliance with the legislation or regulation. And in some cases, when you look at a lot of businesses and organizations, they also have risks which they can have in terms of sanctions being imposed from a point of view of environmental sustenance. So when we talk about these schemes which are being introduced, or we are looking at introducing the scheme wherein the plastic bottles are going to be collected back, and that is looking at a moral responsibility of organizations ensuring that they adhere to preserving the environment for the future generations by minimizing let's put it this way, the outflow of plastics happening into the environment, which could mean that one of the things which the Greenpeace and some of the reports have brought out is that there's a lot of plastic ending into the oceans. And in order to avoid that, they want organizations which produce and use plastics, like when you look at large retailers, the amount of plastics they are sending to landfills. When you look at Pepsi and Coke, for example, some of the organizations which depend on, bottled water, for example. And in those cases, what they're trying to do now is create a legislation which will allow these companies to look at, adhering to a legislation which will help in creating what is called sustainable value. That means what they produce, they are able to a certain extent also liable to bring it back into the system so that it is recycled, reused. And if it's not recyclable or reused, then it is disposed of in a manner which does not harm the environment. So when we look at this particular framework, we are looking at a risk management strategy, and then that is what you need to apply to a particular product by taking an example and referring to the risk management framework. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay. Any questions on this?
No, I haven't got any questions. You will be sending that presentation, won't you?
Yeah, they are all on the Moodle in any case, but I will send them.
I haven't got as far as that one. Okay, that'll be fine.
I'll send them across